Hi there, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. This is, as I hope you know, Left Side of the Aisle. I'm Larry Erickson, your host, and for the next half hour I'm going to be going on about some things, some particular things that I think are important enough to comment on and be aware of. If you have any reactions, please email them to me directly. My personal email is whoviating, WHOVIATING @AOL.com. Or you can go to my website, Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL will be over here somewhere a couple of times during the show. You get the email address from there, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather do that. If you do email me, please include something in the subject line that makes it clear this is about the show. It's not spam, which I, of course, like you, get way too much. And be a little patient about getting an answer because I stink at answering my email. So we're going to start with some good news, as I always like to. We got some real heavy-duty stuff coming up first, so let's try to start with some good news. And actually here what we have is a case of good news that is wrapped inside some not good news. The not good news involves a long-running class action suit against Google and two other media outlets who are accused of circumventing technologies to block the use and the implementation of cookies on their web browsers. And Google and these other companies are getting around that in order to have cookies to track their users' web histories. In a significant loss for online privacy, on November 9th, the Third Circuit Court of Appeals dismissed the suit, saying that contrary to the plaintiffs' claim that the actions of Google and the others violated the Wiretap Act, in fact they hadn't, because Google was a party to the conversation, to the communication, not a third-party eavesdropper. Which personally I find a rather bizarre decision, because to me it's like saying that if I go to a store and shop for something, that it is then entirely proper for that store to secretly follow me everywhere I go to shop after that, even if I've specifically told them I want them to not do that. Okay, so that's the not good news. What's the good news? The good news is that in that same decision, the court was careful to make another point. Courts have pretty consistently ruled the government does not need a warrant to spy on so-called non-content data or metadata, the metadata of our communications. They can record, for example, who made a phone call, who received a phone call, who sent an email, who got an email, without recording the content of what was said or written. But in its decision, the Third Circuit made clear that merely tracking the URLs that a person visits can constitute collecting the contents of their communications and therefore can violate the Wiretap Act. As an example of how that would happen, Julian Sanchez of the Cato Institute said that, for example, if you go to webmd.com, that counts as metadata. But if you go to webmd.com/family pregnancy, that indicates something real about the content of your communication. It records more than just the visit to the site itself. The real important point here, is that the declaration of the court's ruling, the finding that what's supposedly metadata can in fact be content, doesn't apply just to Google, doesn't apply just this case. It is a finding that would apply to everybody, including the feds. Now, this is not completely new territory. The Department of Justice already claims that it looks for a warrant when it tries to get the URLs from a suspect's web history. The judges in the Google case are able to cite a previously secret decision by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court ruling that a URL can be content. But the DOJ's policy is just that. It's a policy, not a legal requirement. And the FISA court ruling was secret. This is public. And those two differences actually matter. In some ways, the finding may not seem particularly important, since the whole idea of metadata being easily subject to warrantless spying may be going away. In fact, due to changes in the law, which are driven by the revelations of Edward Snowden, who was the one who first brought the massive NSA spying on our phone metadata to light, the program is supposed to end as of November 29th. Now, I say supposed to because the metadata will still be collected. It will just be held by the phone companies instead of the feds. And the spooks can still get a look at it. They just have to meet a rather higher standard than they do now in order to be allowed to do it. So, it's better, but it's not really good. It's not really going away. But what matters right now is that it may be just because this impending date of November 29th makes it seem politically safe. But the fact is, the decision in the Google case is one among some others that hint at an increasing willingness of the courts to challenge the spooks on their legal authority. For one example, last May, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals found the Patriot Act did not authorize the metadata collection program. And while the court did not rule on the constitutionality of the program, it did say it was illegal, unauthorized by law. More importantly, on November 9th, U.S. District Judge Richard Leon of the District of Columbia ruled that the NSA's entire metadata collection program is unconstitutional, and he ordered it be stopped immediately. He found that the constitutional violation involved here was so egregious that even though the program is supposedly going to end in a few weeks, it could not be allowed to continue for a single day. Now, the ruling has a limited legal impact because it actually only applies technically to the two people who actually brought the suit. But the principle involved, the finding of unconstitutionality, is what's important, and that will clearly survive past November 29th. And the fact is, courts very rarely challenge the spooks who are waving national security banners around, which itself makes the ruling significant. David Greens, he's a senior staff attorney and civil liberties director for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, says it could set a precedent for future cases because the NSA justifies most of its other spying programs using the same sort of arguments that Judge Leon rejected in this one. So while this case is limited good news, it is still good news, and it does offer the hope for bigger good news in the future. On a related matter, since it does involve government spying on civilians, the Attorney General of Oregon, her name is Ellen Rosenblum, said she is appalled by the discovery that the state's Criminal Justice Division, which she supervises, have been tracking the Twitter feeds of a number of Oregon residents based solely on their use of certain hashtags, specifically hashtag Black Lives Matter. She gave no details of the scope of the digital spying, but she did say she's investigating the matter and rather strongly hinted that the practice was going to stop, which again is good news. And we're going to take a very quick break. Okay, we have to talk about Paris. On Friday, November 13th, terrorists who appear to be connected to Daesh, or ISIS, killed 129 people and wounded about 350 more in a series of attacks involving suicide bombers and, more deadly, automatic weapons and explosives aimed at crowds of people at sidewalk cafes and at the Bataclan Theater. Daesh has claimed responsibility for the carnage, even though there remain questions about how much of the plan was controlled from Syria as opposed to organized locally, and so how much was ideologically driven rather than organizationally driven. But that distinction, of course, does not matter to the dead and the wounded or to their friends and families, nor should it. Nor, in fact, should it matter to us, except as part of some overriding strategic calculation. What matters more is the pain and the suffering and the blood and the death. More death, more blood, more suffering, more pain. As always happens, the first question that springs to mind, it's just natural for it to happen, the first question is why? And the answer to that question, when you think it through, is actually important because it can help us point to an answer to the later, bigger, ultimately more important question of what now? But the first thing to do, the very first thing, even if it's only for a short time, the first thing to do is mourn. To mourn and to condemn the attackers. who, no matter how many injustices, real or imagined, they may cite in their defense, they are still responsible for what they do, and they are still cowardly murderers. And then, after we mourn, we can ask why. Now, there are, of course, already officials and experts making statements, sopping up ink and airtime with answers that run the gamut. Answer the question why with answers that run the gamut from they hate us to their fanatics and back again, as if such a puny range represented really thoughtful thought and analytical analysis. So instead of speculating on why this happened, why did they hate us, or dismissing the question with some version of haters gonna hate, how about we ask them? Writing in The Nation recently, Lydia Wilson, field director at Artists International, which she described as a consortium aimed at the scientific study in the service of conflict resolution. She described her experience of questioning ISIS members who had been taken prisoner. Many, and I'm quoting her now, many assume that these fighters are motivated by a belief in the Islamic State, a caliphate ruled by a caliph. But this doesn't hold for the prisoners we are interviewing. They are woefully ignorant about Islam and have difficulty answering questions about Sharia law, militant jihad, and the caliphate. There is no question that these prisoners I am interviewing are committed to Islam. It's just their own brand of Islam, only distantly related to that of the Islamic State. Similarly, Western fighters traveling to the Islamic State are also deeply committed, but it's to their own idea of jihad rather than one based on theological argument or even evidence from the Quran. In other words, what she's saying is that it's not a commitment to radical Islam that's driving these fighters. And in fact, that's a judgment that's seconded by Doug Stone. He's a retired American general who spent over 2 years in Iraq during the U.S. occupation, interviewing prisoners on pretty much a daily basis. He said that 80% of the prisoners he spoke to had the same profile as the ISIS prisoners that Wilson saw. Men in their late 20s who had come to age during the U.S. occupation of Iraq and who had the same complaint, that the U.S. invaded Iraq, overthrew Saddam, and that led to civil war, leaving them as Sunnis oppressed and abandoned. These men now are not driven by the idea of an Islamic caliphate. Rather, ISIS is the one group that offers them a way to defend, or at least to feel like they are defending, their dignity, their family, their tribe. How many times have I said this? How many times have I said that Daesh, that ISIS, grew out of disaffected Sunnis who felt abandoned and then betrayed by the Shia-dominated government in Baghdad, a government that exists because of the United States? Now, maybe it's a step too far to say that we created Daesh, but it is not a step too far to say that we created the conditions under which it could take root and flourish. And that all points to the answer to the question, what now? And the first, most important part of that answer is what not to do. To not engage in what one writer pointedly called the weaponization of grief, the turning of this crime into an excuse for other, even greater crimes. But of course, that's already happening. French President François Hollande describes that France is now at war. Now, as if France had not been bombing ISIS-held positions in Iraq and more recently Syria since last year. Old questions, what now, are getting old answers. More bombs. And that won't work. It won't. It won't work that unless your goal is to slightly misquote Mark Twain, your goal is to drown the thunder of the bombs with the shrieks of their wounded writhing in pain. It won't work unless your goal is more senseless killing, more blood, more anger, more fury, more militants ready to die, ready to commit terror, ready to commit havoc on the innocent. And that new anger is already being generated by another event, one that occurred just one day before the Paris attacks. A pair of suicide bombers who appear to have been sent by ISIS blew themselves up in separate attacks in Beirut, the capital of Lebanon. 43 people were killed, 250 more wounded. To the almost complete silence of the West. No Lebanese flags were flown. No cries of "we are all Lebanese now" flowed across the social media. No buildings were lit in the red, green, and white of the Lebanese flag. Oh, it was reported, surely enough, it was reported in the major media. For example, the New York Times reported it. They carried one story on page 6. In response to the Paris attacks, by comparison, the Time ran 6 stories on the first day, 3 of them on the front page, 2 of them above the fold. There were 20 follow-up stories the next day, 4 of them on the front page, 15 more the day after that, again 4 on the front page. 41 stories in 3 days, 11 of them on the front page. Perhaps even more telling was the fact that in covering the terrorism in Paris, the Times headline was, "Paris terrorist attacks kill over 100." In covering the terrorism in Beirut, the single story on page 6 was initially headlined, "Deadly Blast Hit Hezbollah Area in Southern Beirut," later changed to "Hezbollah Stronghold." Now Hezbollah, as I expect you know, is regarded by the West as a terrorist group. And neither the New York Times, Reuters, NPR, MSNBC, others all joined in shouting Hezbollah in their news coverage. This was despite the fact that the New York Times article itself says that the neighborhood, I'm quoting, typifies working-class Beirut, where Palestinians, Christians, and Syrian refugees, mostly Sunnis, live, work, and shop, and later calls it a bustling area with narrow streets, many small shops and vendors selling fruits and vegetables from stalls and pushcarts. Even ISIS, when it claimed responsibility for the attacks, said the target was Shiite Muslims who they regard as apostates, and they mentioned Hezbollah almost as an afterthought. But none of that mattered. No matter. Somehow, in the eyes of major Western media, the presence of a Hezbollah office in the area made all those civilians, all those Palestinians, all those Christians, all those Syrian refugees just vanish, disappear, blend into a Hezbollah terrorist stronghold. They became other. Well, then no wonder we couldn't be bothered to mourn them or even remember them once some place we thought of as us got attacked. Do you think people in the Middle East don't see that? Do you think they don't see that difference? Do you think they don't see that difference as reflecting the West's indifference to the kind of suffering and terrorism they go through every single day? You think that doesn't fuel anger, rage, fury? How long can we keep making the same stupid mistakes? How long can we keep charging down the same blind alleys? How many times can we tell ourselves, the Democrats' version, a little more bombing, or the Goppers' version, a lot more troops? We'll do what the bombing is failing to do in Syria and Iraq, what 140,000 troops failed to do in Iraq, what 100,000 troops failed to do in Afghanistan. We've got to find another way. We've got to take another way. It has been said quite truthfully that those who engage in vengeance tend to become that which they say they oppose. So we have got to stop imagining that vengeance, that get them back, is the answer or even an answer. We've got to find the courage to say we will not be terrorized, we will not be afraid, we will not be intimidated, but we will not become what we say we oppose. We will not become, or if I'm to be completely honest here, we will stop being terrorists. No, that won't be easy, and no, it won't be safe. But the hard truth is that while you can kill terrorists, you can't kill terrorism. As the recent history of Taliban to Al-Qaeda to Daesh should have taught us, but apparently still hasn't. Terrorism can't be killed and ultimately can't be bombed or invaded into submission except maybe temporarily. It can only be overcome by being dried up, by being desiccated to the point of, like Voldemort in the movie version, turning to dust and blowing away. And doing that requires not attacks but aid, not ultimatums but understanding, not bombs but bread. It requires, bottom line, justice. It requires acting with justice. And the dead everywhere, on every side, deserve no less honor. We're taking a break. And here we are back again. Now it's time for one of our regular features. This is the Outrage of the Week. And it's appropriate because it's actually very closely related to what I was just talking about. In fact, I mentioned a few minutes ago the idea of the weaponization of grief. Closely related to that, of course, is the weaponization of fear. And we are seeing that now in full bloom as well over half the nation's governors, 31 as of the time I was preparing this, which was the night of November 17th. 31 of our nation's governors have called on the federal government to stop admitting Syrian refugees. Most of those governors, all but one of them gobbers, have promised to do everything in their power to prevent such refugees from being settled in their states. Now, while most of the states involved are from the traditionally so-called red areas of the South and the Plains, they do include even some blue states, such as Massachusetts and New Jersey. Now, this is driven, it shouldn't be necessary to say, by plain old-fashioned bigoted xenophobia with a side order of specifically Islamophobia. Because the thing is, none of this anti-immigrant froth arose just now. This is old stuff. Griping about immigrants is old stuff. Immigrants, even legal ones, have been a favorite punching bag of the right wing and the nativists for decade upon decade in this country. But now, there's a new claim, a way to dog whistle your rejection of immigrants, documented or otherwise, a way to dog whistle your rejection of immigrants without, of course, admitting that's what you're doing. Because every one of these governors mentioned the terror attacks in Paris as their reason for this. Every one of them warned darkly of terrorists sliding in among the refugees to bring desolation to our shores. And this is an argument based essentially entirely on a Syrian passport found on or near one of the suicide bombers. That passport was traced back to a crossing into Greece and proved to be either a copy or a forgery when police in Serbia arrested a man with a passport identical to the other one in every way except the photo. So it certainly appears that this passport found in Paris was a fake, which is not surprising considering the active trade in fake passports and fake documents among people trying to escape Syria. But this one, it appears on available evidence, was used by someone somehow connected to ISIS in order to get into France. So why is the argument of the governor still such bull hockey? For one thing, the passport is a red flag. The migration correspondent for The Guardian said that, quoting, "Analysts find it strange that a bomber would remember to bring his passport on a mission, particularly one who does not intend to return alive." More pointedly, Charlie Winter, an analyst focusing on Islamic extremism, tweeted, "Why would a jihadist who expressly rejects all notions of modern citizenship take a passport to a suicide mission? So it would be found." Which makes sense in the context of an observation by Iyad el-Baghdadi. He's an activist who keeps a list, a private list of private Twitter accounts of around 200 to 300 jihadist Twitter accounts, and he reviews them to see what they're thinking. And he tweeted that, quoting, "You know what pissed off Islamist extremists the most about Europe? It was watching their very humane moral response to the refugee crisis." That is, the passport was used and brought to the scene of the attacks specifically so it would be found, for the precise purpose of provoking exactly the sort of reaction that our jackass governors have had, promoting paranoia and suspicion about all Syrian refugees with the intent of driving a wedge between them and the West to convince those trying to flee that there is no place to go because the West will never accept you. The heinous attacks in Paris had nothing to do with Syrian refugees. The suspected mastermind behind the attack, Abdelhamid Abouad, is a French citizen. At least 5 of the 8 suspected militants involved are French nationals. Even French President François Hollande said the attacks had been, quoting him, "planned in Syria, organized in Belgium, perpetrated on our soil with French complicity." As for the U.S. resettlement program, this program the governors are demanding be halted, be stopped, be suspended. The Obama administration plans to admit just 10,000 Syrian refugees over the course of this fiscal year, as compared to the hundreds of thousands that Europe is dealing with. What's more, those 10,000 will have to get through security screenings that typically take 18 to 24 months, and generally only half the applicants actually get through it. And the resettlement program, which has been going on for about 40 years now and has resettled over 3 million refugees into the United States, has seen not one of them commit a terrorist act. These, I can't think of what to call them that's fit for being on air. These scumbags, these foul, ugly toads, these venomous toads occupying and defiling the mansions of the governor's mansions of our nation. These panders to the bigotry of nativism, more interested in a self-serving soundbite than what's good in our national heritage. They're ready to throw the huddled masses yearning to breathe free back into the maelstrom of desperation and war, rather than defend some right-wing donor. Ready to feed our fears and muzzle our morality. These people are contemptible. They are reprehensible. They are an outrage. And just a footnote to that. The day after the Paris attacks, hundreds of people attended a silent vigil in the French city of Lille. About 15 minutes into the vigil, it was interrupted by a group of around 15 people claiming to be supporters of the National Front, a far-right political party led by notorious anti-immigrant bigot Marine Le Pen. The group set up firecrackers and screamed, "Expel Islamists," while unfolding a banner with the same bigoted message. They got more than they bargained for. The crowd turned on them, shouting, "Go away, fascists." The fascists were forced by the crowd back across the square and had to leave under the protection of police, who kept the two groups separated so things didn't get too far out of hand. After they had gone, the crowd broke its silence to sing the French national anthem, La Marseillaise. And in the most recent news, France has announced that, despite what happened, it is not going to change its immigration policy. It is not going to close its borders to refugees. Frankly, I would love to see an occasion where our Sick 31, those governors who want to deny Syrian immigrants a chance to enter, get treated in the same way that their cousin xenophobes did in Lille. That's it. We're going to wrap up for the week. Again, I invite any responses you have to the show, whoviating@aol.com. In the meantime, we will see you next week, so you just have the best week you possibly can. And for now, as always, peace.